Welcome to Week 13 Forum. This week we are surveying the range of options available to governments in responding to the threat of terrorism. I want to focus on the more coercive aspects of that for the little mini lecture, and then we can open the rest of it up to the forum. Martin groups these policies into kind of four constellations of response. At one extreme is the use of military force, which may involve sort of conventional military attacks and seizing of territory. It may involve recruiting, training, and arming, hopefully in that order, paramilitary organizations, so as to kind of preserve a sense of plausible deniability for what often degenerates into dirty wars when resorting to privatized military responses to terrorist groups. Next are two sets of policies short of war, repressive and conciliatory responses. Repressive responses short of war typically rely heavily on intelligence and often include targeting suspected sponsoring nations with economic sanctions, anti-terrorist operations like beefing up security of symbolic targets of terrorism, installing checkpoints and surveillance in and around sensitive potential economic and military targets. When countries gain significant HUMINT on terrorist organizations, some countries will engage heavily in covert operations intended to break up organizations, usually through attritions in the form of targeted killings. Recall Israel's internal security service Shin Bet in their assassination of Yahi Ayash, the engineer. Those kinds of assassinations are feasible when a nation has unprecedented HUMINT operations. Israel's intelligence services are in any top 5 list of nations that are skilled in the recruitment, cultivation, and exploitation of human intelligence. Conciliatory responses involve a nation taking a softer approach. Conciliatory responses may include diplomatic solutions to terrorist-provoked crises, or attempts to address the grievances that terrorists use as justification for violence. As I mentioned in the overview, conciliatory responses are often kind of publicly deprecated, but quietly employed as part of a broader response to political violence. Sometimes such response can be part of what we might call confidence-building exercises to build mutual trust, and sometimes those exercises can bear fruit, but not always. The fourth constellation of responses, reference legalistic attempts, which emphasize response to terrorism through rule of law. These policies may involve steering resources into law enforcement to better enable, specific agencies to investigate, infiltrate, and arrest and prosecute terrorists for committing acts of terrorism. Additionally, states pass legislation designed to criminalize terrorist-related behaviors, including, the idea of conspiracy, that go into engaging in terrorism, as well as introducing levels of aggravation to violence that is attributed to terrorists. And then again, you also have instances where nations' law enforcement agencies engage in cooperative efforts to better interdict terrorist organizations that routinely cross national borders, or further isolating failed and failing states that provide terrorist organizations with sanctuaries. The remainder of the chapter is an extensive survey of the successful and unsuccessful use of each of these broad constellations of counterterrorist policies. And we have to recognize that certain kinds of policies match far better to some threats than to others. I note that terrorist organizations are rarely appropriate objects for the application of direct kinetic military force. Using conventional military units, be it infantry invading and occupying territory or the use of air power, is the bluntest of tools in the counter-terrorist toolkit. And unfortunately, Maslow's hammer often prevails. If you don't know what Maslow's hammer is, it's a Russian proverb. For a carpenter whose only tool is a hammer, every problem is a nail. Israel has on a number of occasions attempted to invade and occupy territory controlled by groups that they believe are terrorists. The Shiite-dominated Palestinian group Hezbollah and the Sunni-dominated group Hamas. The results have been decidedly mixed. During Israel's 1982 invasion and occupation of southern Lebanon, for example, Israel stood by as Christian phalangist militia massacred Palestinian Shiites in the Lebanese villages of Sabra and Shatila. The IDF was aware of what was going on and did nothing, and the international community basically blamed them. As many as 3,500 Palestinian Shiites were slaughtered over a 3-day period. And think about, wrap your mind around that many people being killed in that short of a time frame. Initial use of military force often has far-reaching implications. Hezbollah, for example, committed several years to entrenching southern Lebanon, and when Israel attempted to repeat its intervention into Lebanon in 2006, they were ultimately stalemated and compelled to withdraw, and that was viewed as a defeat. The IDF kind of experienced similar issues when they launched a conventional military assault on the Gaza Strip in 2014. I don't know, for those of you who don't know, the Gaza Strip is a coastal enclave of Palestinians. It's only about 139 miles in circumference. It's mainly kind of a strip. So in some instances, it's only a couple of dozen miles wide, but it's, a few dozen, I'm trying to remember, 100 and something miles long. And it contains 1.4 million radicalized Sunni fundamentalist Palestinians who are led by Hamas, who have, announced their belief that they need to just kill every Israeli in the world. And again, like I said, they are radicalized. The IDF invaded the Gaza Strip with the announced intention of destroying the tunnel systems that Hamas had been using to kind of bring materials in and create factories for building what were known as Qassam rockets, which were very crude, basically unguided rockets that they were using the tunnels to launch into Israeli cities neighboring Gaza. The result of what was a 3-phase conventional assault, which included airstrikes, followed by a ground invasion, followed by a gradual withdrawal, and then kind of the resumption of a strangling blockade over that area, provoked a considerable amount of international controversy and again further radicalized the inhabitants of Gaza and frankly likely strengthened the grip of Hamas over that area. So in short, responding to terrorist provocation with conventional military force is a high-risk option. Terrorist organizations rarely present an appropriate target for conventional forces, and when they do, they often prove difficult to root out. In my opinion, conventional military strikes or campaigns are hard to justify, and Israel's experience with such policies is decidedly mixed. What do you think about using the hammer of war to respond to terrorism? I mean, again, it might make you feel good as a country, but in the long run, it oftentimes proves counterproductive, because in many instances, you're doing precisely what terrorists want. Options short of outright military attacks include the use of punitive and preemptive strikes. Reprisals against terrorists for incidents that have already taken place can be effective, provided that they are proportionate to the terrorism to which the strike was a response. Again, such actions often provoke controversy, illustrated by the unpopularity of the Reagan administration's airstrikes against Libya in March of 1986. Really divided us from Europe. Preemption is an even more controversial option. Israel has routinely launched preemptive strikes against states and terrorist groups they believe to be planning to attack them, and preemption was a clear element of the Bush doctrine. We won't wait around to be struck, but we will instead act when we have clear evidence of an imminent attack. The invasion and occupation of Iraq was justified on preemptive grounds, as numerous Bush administration officials stated at the time. We don't want the smoking gun to come in the form of a mushroom cloud. Legally, preemption is hard to justify within international law, and most states disavow preemption as a policy. The Bush administration's war of choice, again, split U.S. allies and raised doubts about American leadership. Israel's frequent use of preemption has seriously damaged its standing in the world. Most of you probably think of Israel as a U.S. ally and as, one of the good guys. But their status among non-American Westerners is much more controversial. I want to address Martin's discussion of war in the shadows coercive covert operations, and then kind of eventually probably throw it up to the forum. Many of the actions that take place in the shadows are activities that most nations do not want to acknowledge publicly. Most nations formally disavow the use of assassinations. For example, the United States Executive Order 12333 renewed the U.S. pledge not to employ assassinations of foreign leaders as an instrument of foreign policy. Despite that executive order, though, we've killed an awful lot of terrorist leaders. Does that count as an assassination? Why or why not? In the past, Israel has used assassinations as a form of reprisal. They organized a special unit called Wrath of God to track down and kill the members of Black September that were responsible for the murder of Jewish athletes in the 1972 Munich Olympics. That operation went sideways in 1973 when an innocent North African waiter in Norway, with his wife present, was killed by members of this group. And it illustrates, some of the problems inherent with assassinations. You better be right on the identity, and you better be sure you execute in a way that minimizes casualties to bystanders. And even if you get it right, you will face serious repercussions from the country on which you execute an assassination. The United States has pioneered the use of drones as a kind of a tool of counterterrorism. There's a growing literature attempting to evaluate the parameters of the effectiveness of drone strikes. One article is fairly early, it was written in 2015, that I would recommend that you read if you're interested in the implications of drones for counterterrorism. Is Mark Bowden's piece from The Atlantic. It's entitled "The Killing Machines: How to Think About Drones." It's a bit dated now, but Bowden's article really highlights the extent to which drones are a force multiplier, both from a military and from an intelligence perspective. The problem with drones is much like the problem with air power generally as applied to counterterrorism. A little bit goes a long way, and the line between just enough and too much is vague and constantly shifting. In my opinion, the Obama administration overused drone strikes in ways that somewhat undermined its effectiveness. And if anyone ever tells you I never criticized the Obama administration, you now have evidence. As with drones, so with many or most coercive options, the more you deploy a specific modality, the more controversial it becomes, and the better able terrorist organizations are to identify workarounds to defeat that specific modality. The last issue I want to pull out of the chapter are the different special forces operations, special operations forces that most countries have to respond specifically to terrorist events. They go all the way, they all go through intensive training. There's a great deal of shared training among those units. The U.S. has more such units than any other industrialized nation. Of particular note, of course, are SEAL Team 6 and the Delta Force, but just about every branch of the military have special forces that are specifically trained in counterterrorism. So there's a lot of interesting stuff in this chapter, so let's dive in. What, in your opinion, is the most important takeaway from this chapter? What did you find most interesting? What aspects of this chapter did you find most troubling or difficult to understand? Let's talk it out.